talking about the rest of the spine. So in the previous video, we already talked about the cervical spine or the neck. Now we're going to be moving down to the other two segments of the spine, the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine, so the lower back and the upper back. And then we're also going to talk about the pelvis, because I feel like when you talk about the lumbar spine and you're talking about the positions and the movements that it does, a lot of that is impacted by the way that we move our pelvis. So you really can't isolate just one at a time. A lot of the movements are going to impact both. So we're going to tie those two together. But we already talked about the cervical spine with those 6 movements, and the same movements apply to the rest of the spine. There's flexion and extension moving on the sagittal plane. So flexion and extension. And then there's lateral flexion to the right and lateral flexion to the left, moving on the coronal plane. Then you have rotation, rotation right, rotation left, moving on the transverse plane, right? You're swinging around that way. Thinking about the planes of movement might start to become helpful when we talk about the pelvis, because the pelvic movements can get a little bit confusing. They're different from the terms that we use on the other parts of the body. But the other one that I want to talk about, so we said in the yoga board video that there are 6 movements of the spine, and then there's the 7th one that I like to throw in, especially in yoga, where we think about axial elongation. And I kind of bring attention to the top of my head or the base of the skull right there where it connects to the top of the cervical spine, and to the bottom of my tailbone. So if I am standing in mountain pose or anatomical position, I'm thinking about moving those 2 points away from each other, stretching the spine out, taking pressure off of the discs in between the vertebrae, and decreasing the emphasis on the curves in my spine. Creating length. That's the process of elongating through the axis of the body. The spine is that axis through which all those different movements happen, but we're trying to lengthen it out. And that has some carryover into a bunch of different parts in our practice. When we're doing breath work and we want to increase the space between the rib cage and the pelvis to allow for expansion, things like that. Or poses like downward facing dog, where we want to get away from that compressive force and make it more of an expansion and an elongation through the spine by drawing the hips back and up. Okay, so that's axial elongation. Now let's go down to the thoracic spine, and we're going to talk about that segment. It's the longest segment of the spine. It has 12 vertebrae, and it is super important for yogis because this is the space where the ribs attach to our spine. And that's important because the thoracic spine has the least mobility because the ribs are there, but it's also the most stable part of the spine. When it gets a little bit too stable and it is stiff, then it impacts the ability of our rib cage to expand and contract, and for us to do different breath work, especially when we're moving the spine in different poses. So we want to keep a good amount of mobility through the thoracic spine in order to create freedom in our breath. And knowing the different movements and how we can focus on the thoracic aspect of the spine is going to help you with that carryover into your breath work. So for the thoracic spine, I'll try to isolate this from the neck, but a lot of times the neck and the thoracic spine kind of follow each other. But I'm going to go into flexion on the sagittal plane. So I'm going to flex my thoracic vertebrae and then come back into neutral. I'm going to extend my thoracic vertebrae and come back into neutral. Lateral flexion to the right, lateral flexion to the left. And I'm just trying to isolate this in kind of my upper and mid back. And then we have rotation. So I can rotate, really thinking about rotating from my shoulders to get that thoracic spine extension. The head just kind of follows along normally. Or rotation, thoracic spine rotation. And that's happening on a transverse plane there, spinning around. Okay, flexion, extension, lateral flexion each side, rotation each side. We have those 6 movements of the spine. So what poses in our practice do we actually pull that in with. And there's a few different ones. Of course, cat and cow. We keep coming back to that cat and cow movement because we get so much flexion and extension through the cervical, the thoracic, and the lumbar, and the pelvis. We get a lot of pelvic movement with that cat and cow. So that's a great spot to start out with. And when I'm trying to isolate my thoracic spine, I'm thinking a lot about the movements of the scapula, because when the scapula is moving a lot, it's going to help me to increase the awareness of my thoracic spine and create more movement through those vertebrae. And the breath is going to be a huge help here. The larger I make my inhale, the easier it's going to be for me to open the front of the thoracic spine. And the more I exhale and pull the ribs in, the easier it is for me to go into flexion with the thoracic spine. So feel that back and forth and how the breath really helps with that. Then we'll go into what's called puppy pose or heart opening pose, Anahata Asana. Walking the hands forward, letting your chin drop and letting your heart drop. This is a pose of thoracic extension. It's quite tricky to get really isolated extension in the thoracic spine, but this is one of those poses that we can hone in on that area. I'm also getting a lot of shoulder movement here. I'm going into the end range of my shoulder flexion. Okay, so don't get confused with that. I'm going into spine extension but shoulder flexion. Okay, and then coming up, I'm going to come back through table pose, and I want to work on thoracic rotation. And that's going to happen from my shoulders and from my arms. I'm going to rotate to open, and then I'm going to rotate to scoop underneath. Inhale, open, exhale, scoop. So we're just twisting the thoracic spine each way when we do that kind of a movement. And I can switch to the other arm. Rolling open, rolling closed. This is a prep movement that I use for thread the needle. That would be the deeper version of that thoracic rotation. Coming all the way down. You can feel your bottom shoulders really tucked underneath you. That's where a good amount of the rotation comes from. And if I want to go deeper, I'm going to open the top arm, and you feel that rotate even more. Drop that down and come back up. Okay, so those were the movements of the thoracic spine. So now we're going to go down to the lower back and talk about the lumbar spine. And like I said, the lumbar spine and the pelvis are like this. So you're going to see, I'll kind of talk about the movements that they do in conjunction with each other. So the first one is going to be flexion and extension. And if I go into lumbar flexion, you can see I'm trying to hunch from here as opposed to that thoracic flexion up there. So lumbar flexion, I get really round in this space. And I'm trying to keep my pelvis stable there. So lumbar flexion, and then lumbar extension. A lot of the standing back bends and the kneeling back bends, think camel pose, are going to have a lot of lumbar extension, because you'll see that this part of the back really hollows out when you go into a back bend that way, or if I was in standing, same kind of idea. Okay, then lateral flexion is a little bit hard to isolate. We mostly start lateral flexion from the thoracic spine. The lumbar just kind of follows it, but this side is closed off. This side of the vertebra is going to be opened more, and then I'll switch to the other side, closing off here, opening, spreading out the vertebrae. Less pressure on the discs on my right side. There's a little more pressure into the disc, or discs, on my left side. Expansion and compression. and we'll come back up. So again, that happens on the coronal plane. It's that side to side movement. That would also be like shoulder abduction and adduction. So lateral flexion. And then rotation. When you're doing rotation from the lumbar spine, think about moving from the legs and the hips. When we did thoracic rotation, I was rotating from my shoulders. Lumbar rotation is going to be isolated more by moving the lower body. And this can be accomplished pretty well down on the mat. If I come into my twist by dropping my legs over to the side, you can see that the rotation starts at the bottom and it's going to move up my back. I'm going to get a pretty good portion of my spine covered with that rotation. But we're starting out by rotating through the lumbar vertebrae. And I'll come up to center, rock that to the other side. And then back up to center. Okay, so that was the 3 portions of the spine, and we did the 6 movements at each of those portions of the spine. So now we're going to talk about the pelvis, and the pelvis is the key to what happens with the rest of the spine. When we make minor adjustments to where our pelvis is in different poses, it's going to have this cascade effect to all the other vertebrae because they're so strongly connected. The pelvis is the foundation from which the shape of the spine is built on top of. Okay, so the first one, I'll show you this one in standing so we can start in neutral. So here's my anatomical position, and I'm going to move my arm so that you can see the side view. But this is about neutral. My pelvis is kind of straight up and down. Here's my hip points, and here's the hip crests. Now I'm going to go into an anterior pelvic tilt, and watch what happens to my lower back. So anterior pelvic tilt, my hip points drop down, and my tailbone lifts up. I get this big hollow through my back. My abdominal muscles are stretched out, and my lower back muscles are shortened and contracted. Now go the opposite way. I'm going to tuck my tailbone and start to roll back. My lower back gets really straight and flat. My abs are very well engaged, especially the lower portion of my abs. But it's a little bit of a tug right on the front of my hips. And you can see how I'm over straightened. I don't have any curve in my lower back, which is not ideal. Okay, and then I'm going to release into neutral. There's a slight hollow, there's a slight activation in my abs. It's a balance between the front and the back. I'm not totally anterior and I'm not completely posterior. Okay? When the knees are bent, I'll have more freedom of movement to do that, and you'll find that again in cat and cow. So if I bend my knees a little bit and I go anterior pelvic tilt, I can really push that forward, and then posterior pelvic tilt, I can tuck my tail underneath and hollow out my belly. So that's the forward and back movement. And you want to kind of use the pubic bone and the tailbone as a front and back reference. When you're going into a posterior pelvic tilt, the tailbone tucks under and the pubic bone lifts. When I go anterior, it's the opposite. My tailbone untucks and my pubic bone is going to drop. Okay, so try to connect to those 2 landmarks and which direction they're actually moving for you. Think about this movement happening in the sagittal plane. Okay, so it would be just like flexion and extension with the arms, or flexion and extension with the neck. It's anterior and posterior pelvic tilt happening on that plane. It is going to affect your lumbar spine because when I go into an anterior pelvic tilt, I end up with a lot of spine extension in my lumbar. When I go into a posterior pelvic tilt, it's going to start to push me toward flexion in the lumbar. My lumbar is going to start to curve forward. There's less pressure pushing down on the discs of the back, but the bad thing is the pressure is kind of going back toward the nerves. And then as I tilt forward, there's less pressure on the front of the discs. Okay? So that one, not so bad, forward and back. The next 2 movements are a little bit more unusual and can start to raise a little bit of confusion. But we're going to do a side-to-side movement of the pelvis, and this becomes important when we're doing balancing poses or single foot stands, or even in balancing table, when we only have support on one side. If the pelvis isn't stable, it will start to do these unusual rotations or shifts side to side. So first we're going to talk about lateral rotation. Sometimes you'll hear this called a pelvic obliquity. If it's something that's like a permanent postural feature, you'll say that their pelvis has an oblique angle. It's not something that we want. So here's my pelvis. Okay, here are my hip points, the ASIS, and here's my hip crest on each side. Pretty level when I'm standing in mountain or anatomical position. Now I'm going to show you what the lateral shift of the pelvis looks like, and I'm going to do this by bending my knee. So if I bend my right knee and just relax, my pelvis drops down to that side. Okay, you can see this hip point is now lower than my other hip point, and then I come back up and I find level. I'll do that on the other side. Shift, I'm just letting it drop. Okay, you can see that oblique angle that I have with my pelvis. Come back up to center. So this becomes an issue, like I said, in balancing poses. So say I was going to come up onto one foot, I can hold my pelvis pretty stable, but a lot of students who haven't been practicing for a while or have weakness in the pelvic girdle might look like that when they're trying to balance. So this is an issue because when my pelvis drops, my spine is going to have to curve along with it. And I would much rather have the pelvis straight and the spine completely lined up when I'm in that position. When the pelvis goes into that lateral shift, my lumbar spine is going to have some lateral flexion. Okay, so that kind of goes well together. A lateral shift in the pelvis is going to cause lateral flexion in the lumbar spine. This also becomes an issue when you're doing seated hip openers, and I'll try and show you this from the back. I'm going to go into Gomukhasana with my legs, and my hips are not warmed up, so I'll probably be a good example of this. Yep, there we go. You can see this hip is raised up compared to my bottom hip, and what happens is my spine is going to be curved to the side to try to accommodate that, because I still want my head straight up. I'm not going to be slumped over to the side like that. So in order to make this safer on my lower back, I would want to use a prop and bring myself up, prop my low hip until I can get somewhere closer to level. That's a little bit better. And of course I would warm up my hips before I would do this normally, but there we go. And then my spine is going to be much straighter and happier. So if I start to bend forward, it's going to have equal force as I go deeper into the pose. All right, so that's the lateral shift that you're trying to watch for, or the pelvic obliquity. The next movement is transverse rotation of the pelvis, okay? And it follows the same plane as rotation with the rest of our spine, right? So if we were doing rotation around this way, it would be on the transverse plane. The pelvis works the same way. So here's my transverse plane, splits the pelvis right there. A rotation would mean that this hip point moves in front of the other one, or this hip point moves in front of the other one. Okay? This will happen in a lot of different poses. Sometimes when we're doing twisting poses, we're trying to keep the pelvis stable. If we keep the pelvis stable and we rotate, it means that we're trying to isolate that rotation in the spinal column or between the vertebrae. If we let the pelvis start to rotate, and here you can see as my knees stagger, my hip is also rotated, or my pelvis I should say, is also rotated. And I can go into a twist like that. It just means that my pelvis is following me. Sometimes that can take some of the strain off of the SI joint. Depends on the health of your back. You can use that if it helps you to accomplish poses with less strain in your back. So here I'm going to the other side. You can see that difference between my knees is showing you how far shifted my pelvis is on that transverse plane. Okay, so if I came back up, my pelvis would be rotated like that, and then I have to bring it back around to center. All right, So we have the anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. We have the lateral shift of the pelvis. One side goes higher than the other. And then we have a transverse rotation where one side goes in front of the other side. Now, I wanted to show you Warrior 2 really quickly because this is a pose where pelvic alignment is emphasized as being hip points squared to the side of the mat, right? When we're in Warrior 2, we're trying to have that open side stance. So I'll set my feet up and start to bend. And I'm going for an open stance with my legs. I'll swing my arms up to 90 degrees of abduction, and I'm going to rotate my head to the right to gaze over that middle finger for the drishti point. But the pelvis is really what I'm thinking about here, and specifically what it's going to do to my knee. So if I have tight hips, instead of my pelvis being squared toward the to the side of the mat, my hip points are kind of, let's say right about there. And then the teacher says to me, square your pelvis to the side of the mat, and I start to try to go like this. Okay, squaring my pelvis to the side of the mat. Now watch what happened to my front knee. It collapsed in exactly the way that we don't want to happen. Because if my knee hangs out like this for a long time, it's going to stress the ligaments on the inside of my knee that create stability in that hinge joint that we don't want to mess with. So I would much rather have my knee out, lined up with the hip joint, lined up with my ankle joint so that it's supported and stacked, rather than to force my pelvis into perfect alignment and have my knee just collapse. Okay, so keep that in mind. A similar kind of thing happens in Warrior 1. And I'll swing around this way. So in Warrior 1, the cue is that the hips are squared toward the front of the mat. But if my back leg is down, it can be rather challenging. So I'll kind of open it up a little bit. My hips are not directly towards center. If I start to pull around like this, a lot of people will have discomfort on the inside of their back leg for this one. So be aware of that. To fix that, you can square the foot and have the heel go straight back. Then there isn't this torquing movement on the knee. As you're trying to push your hip forward, it's going to create a torque in the knee that's going to cause that unhappiness there. This is kind of the new foot stance that we're using for Warrior 1 as a way to keep knees safer, especially with beginning students. And my students who have been practicing for a while, they like to do the classic Warrior 1. Their knees are okay with that, that's fine. But I tend to, even in my practice, do this foot stance more frequently because I feel like my lower back is just happier when I do this version. I know if I'm really aggressive in practicing a lot of Warrior 1, sometimes the next day my lower back or my knee can be a little bit cranky. So I've learned from that process and adjusted the way that I do my practice, which is exactly what I want you guys to do with understanding all of these different movements and the ways that we can change our alignment to increase our safety. Figure out the things in your practice that work for your body, figure out the things that don't work for your body, and take those things out. Okay, so next we're going to be going down to the actual hip joint, and we'll have a whole bunch of things to talk about with that one. So hopefully you'll stick around and watch the next video for the hip. Thank you for joining me. Namaste.